Hi, my name is Greg Dunlap, and thanks for coming to my talk, Designing Content Authoring Experiences. I've been involved in the Drupal community for almost 20 years at this point, which is insane. I got my start at Drupal 5, actually working right here in Seattle at the Seattle Times, and I got my start in Drupal speaking right here in Seattle at the very first Seattle Drupal camps and the first Pacific Northwest Drupal summits, and so this is a cool event for me to come back to. I just moved back into the area very recently. So I work at Bixel. We're a mission-driven consulting company working alongside government clients to help them develop better services and experiences for the communities that they serve. We do exclusively federal government contracting. Most recently, one of the cooler projects that we worked on was the relaunch of Vote.gov, which ended up getting tweeted out by someone named Taylor Swift, that was a pretty cool thing to experience. But it's really cool. I've been doing a lot of civic tech work for the last several years, and it's really cool to help to take the opportunity to expand that and grow in that work. So content authoring. There's a quote by a guy who's very well known in the content management world named Dean Barker that I really love. In my experience, the number one complaint of organizations looking to replace their CMSs is simply our authors hate it. And I think that the funny thing is that in a lot of these cases, people aren't really complaining about their CMS per se. What they're really complaining about is that the CMS was designed without them in mind. Custom functionality was created that doesn't fit with how they work. They were complaining about business requirements sent down on high and shoved down their throats, about being disenfranchised from the system that they're expected to use on a day-to-day basis. They hate systems that are not designed with their needs and use cases in mind. They don't hate Drupal, they hate whoever developed their Drupal sites. And it's kind of ridiculous because when you spend, literally millions of dollars building an enterprise CMS, you want people to actually engage with it. If they're filled with dread every time they log in, then they're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on building quality content. They're going to get in, get out as quickly as they can, and get on with their days. And it's just like not how you create quality content in your system. So there's a lot of things that we can start to do to address this problem, but there's sort of a overarching 30,000-foot view problem that's above that I want to get into first. And in order to do that, we're going to look at a brief history of content management on the web. So in the beginning, there were files. I'm sure there are several people in this room who remember these days. Every page on the web was a single HTML file. And if you wanted a new page, you made a new file. And the files had to be pulled down from the server they were on, edited, and put back. And if there was something you wanted changed in every file, you changed it in every file. And hopefully you weren't working on the same file as someone else at the same time, because somebody was going to be really unhappy at the end of that day. And this is how many of us built our first websites back in the beginning of time, and it was exhausting. And during this time, organizationally, web content was mostly owned by the programmers or system administrators who ran the website. They were the people with the specialized knowledge of how the internet and these servers and their wacky command lines worked. And if content needed to be changed, you had to contact them and they'd change it for you because they were the only ones who could. And in fact, half the time, they were the only ones writing the content because they were the only ones who knew the website existed in the first place. Content during this time was very simple. Nobody really thought about it. It was not organizationally important. You put some words on a web page and you called it a day. The tools required specialized knowledge, but the content needs were extremely simple. Now, over time, as organizations began realizing the strategic importance of the web, they wanted more and more control over that content because it became more and more vital to their organizational goals. But they lacked the skills or knowledge to use the tools that were available. And that's where people started to build content management systems to bridge that gap. The earliest ones were mostly homegrown, little more than an interface to write HTML into a very simple form. This is actually the first content management system I ever built. It was for a friend of mine who ran a design agency in Tennessee, and this was for a church that he did. And you could create blocks, or you couldn't create blocks. You could create a block and put text into it. A programmer would still have to put it on the page, but once it was on a page, you could edit that block in this little box here and save it, and those things would be reflected back onto the site. This is the fancier second version. The first one didn't actually have the HTML editor in it. You had to write your own HTML in order to create this. But this was really important because this was an enabler for people. It allowed people to have access to the website, and the sysadmins no longer held the keys to everything. It also allowed it a level of reuse. If you wanted a block in the text of your footer on every page, you could put it there, edit once, and it would change everywhere. You got this goofy little visual editor that would give you an idea of how your content would look. It seems ridiculous now, but it was a big step forward at the time. And it was the beginning of a switch. The tools were on their way to becoming more approachable and less specialized, but the content was becoming more specialized because more planning was needed to create content that worked throughout larger organizations. And since the content was more critical to their success, it required more care. That leads us to phase 3, which is CMS maturity. The last 15 years or so. And a couple of critical things have happened during this phase. And one is that content management systems have matured incredibly to the point where, arguably, they are highly usable without a lot of specialized training. However, at the same time, the web has changed incredibly in ways that have caused the content itself to become much more complicated. I think we can trace this back to the launch of the iPhone, where mobile devices have changed the way that we interact with sites. We have to allow for different screen sizes when we are designing and putting content together. We've also become more focused on enabling users with assistive devices, prioritizing accessibility. SEO and social media have changed the way that people interact with content, and everybody expects a much higher level of quality than they did before. And of course, for organizations, the web has become their marketing platform. It is the key to everything that they do digitally. So the trend that we've seen over time is as our tools have become simpler, our content has become more complicated. So what? So what does this have to do with content authoring? Well, first off, I think a lot of these kinds of issues we think of from the perspective of Drupal. And it's like, what can we do in Drupal to make X, Y, or Z better? And what can we do in Drupal's admin to make things easier for content authors? And I think it's kind of the wrong question. I think what we should be thinking about, if we're thinking about this, is that the complexity comes from the content, not from the system. And so what can we do to support complex and varied content needs that organizations bring to the table? And if we are focusing on solving complex content problems, then the answers are going to be different depending on the organization in question, because every organization's content needs are different. Different organizations have different needs and different types of content and different types of authors, which means that solving it in Drupal is hard because you're not designing it for anybody specifically when everybody has specific needs. Here are a couple of examples of organizations that I've worked with in the last couple of years. So we've got a tech startup. They are a commercial enterprise running on a single marketing site. They have professional trained marketing people who have experienced CMS before. They're knowledgeable about the web and how it works, and they have SEO-focused product marketing content. On the other hand, we also built a platform for a state government, and that's a platform of sites across multiple government agencies who are mostly, their authors are subject matter experts in whatever fields that they're running. They lack real CMS experience, they don't know how the web works, and they're generating broad service information for their constituents. The kinds of authoring experiences that I'll build for those two clients are very, very different. And that means that context matters. Approaching Drupal's content authoring experience is a monolithic thing where certain solutions are right or wrong is a mistake. There's no best content authoring experience. There's only the best one for the authors that you're working with and the content that you're creating and your organizational goals. So then the question becomes, what can we provide that encourages better content for the use case at hand, given the parameters that we're working with? We can't change the web or the organizations people work at, but what we can do is spend more time understanding the forces at play, taking these users into consideration, and working at improving their lives. And that's what we're going to focus on going forward. And the process looks very much like the process by which you would build the front end of the website. You research, prototype, implement, test, and support and iterate. And that makes sense because your authors are users as much as the people who are visiting your website are users. They're internal users versus external users. We are not going to go through all of this today because there's a lot involved in this topic, but let's look at research, how we find out about the users that we're working with, and implementing how we can build things using broad principles that will make their authoring experiences better. So, research. The benefits of user research are pretty well known probably by the people in this room, but there's some differences when you're talking about internal users versus external users. Because with internal users, what you get the opportunity to do is connect and build relationships with people, which you don't usually do when you're talking about the external users of your website. And in a lot of organizations, there's a certain level of distrust or even antagonism between the content authors and the people who build and run the CMS. Bridging that gap can be difficult, but the first step is sitting down and listening to the people who use it. And you know what? They're probably going to be pretty happy about that because nobody's probably ever asked them their opinion about anything before. Give them a seat at the table, and that can be the first step towards bridging that gap. And when I start a new project and we're talking about the stakeholders we need to bring into our initial meetings and workshops, I always make sure they bring in the editorial team because their voice is really important in success. And if you want people to not hate the CMS that you're building, you have to get them involved in the process. So there are a couple of ways that we usually do that. The first is through interviews. You want to figure out who your authors are and what they're struggling with. So you sit down and talk with them. This is some of the most direct feedback you can possibly bring to the table. You can hear day-to-day frustrations, identify functionality that's missing, and establish big picture goals or prioritize the issues that you need to hit. If you hear multiple people talking about their problems with document management or inconsistent design, that's probably something you need to focus on. And this is actually really one of my favorite parts of any project because sitting down and talking to people about their work is one of the reasons why I got into consulting in the first place. Before you start interviewing, you need to develop a protocol for your interviews. The protocol is a template that outlines everything that you would need to conduct the interview. The bulk of the protocol, of course, is the set of questions that you need to ask. But there's also space for background information about the interviewees, introductory material, and instructions for the people giving the interview. Providing any background you have about the people you're talking to can be really helpful because a lot of times there are political or organizational situations that are at hand that are useful to know about when you're going in. You also need to identify who you want to interview. In a small organization, it's easy, but in a larger organization, it can be harder. And my main goal is always to get the largest diversity of viewpoints that I can. You want people who are full-time web pros and people who are struggle bussing their way through the day, working on the CMS 5 or 10 hours a week. You want the biggest departments and the ones with 5 employees who are constantly forgotten about. You want the biggest supporters and the curmudgeonliness curmudgeons. If your system needs to work for all of these use cases, you need to understand where they're all coming from. And once you have the protocol set, we just make a copy for each of the interviews we're conducting and customize them as necessary. We usually do this in Google Docs or Dropbox Paper or whatever tools you have as hands. And then those serve as a guide for the interviewer and a place for people to take notes. And now you've got a common template for everybody so that you can find information down the road when all of these interviews are done. Some other points about conducting to the interviews. I usually try to talk to only one person at a time rather than a group if I can. You foster a better connection and you encourage them to be more open and honest about their answers than if they were in a group. While you did spend a lot of time creating a protocol, you also should feel free to chase interesting threads as you hear them. I often veer in different directions if I hear something that takes something in my brain rather than strictly conducting the interview as it's laid out. Always be digging in, asking why. When you hear something broad, like we need more design flexibility, don't take it at face value. Dig into what the reasoning behind it is. What kind of freedom? What do you need it for? What goal are you attempting to serve by getting this design freedom? Chasing down the specific answers to these broad problems can help zero in on what needs fixing. And a lot of times an author will bring a solution to the table for you, like, I need a color picker in the CMS. Now, that can be for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons might be, I want to be able to highlight a piece of text. Or another reason might be, my school's colors are green and gold. And these are two different problems that require two different solutions, but a color picker is probably not the solution for either of them. And that's what we talk about when we're looking at goals, because when you dig into the why behind the things that people are bringing into, you'll often find wider problems whose solutions can solve multiple issues that people are having across a system, but it's very different than what they bring to you because they don't understand these problems or how their CMS works. Finally, don't hesitate to ask your interviewers to show you what their problem is rather than tell you. This is one of the reasons why, when possible, I like to conduct interviews at people's desks where they have access to their computers, because they can sit down and say, I have a hard time uploading a document, and you can say, show me what your process is, show me how it works, and then you can get a real understanding of how their system is built, where they're running into problems, and what you can do to help resolve it. And then after we're done conducting the interviews, we put them into a matrix like this, which allows us to identify trends, spotlight people that we might want to keep in contact with as we go forward into prototyping and testing, etc. Getting all of this high-level information in one place can be really helpful. We'll also often do workshops, and workshops are one-on-one interactions with people like interviews, but they're done in a group setting. They tend to be interactive activities where people are brainstorming and working through problems, and this can take advantage of group dynamics and help create consensus, or it can be a mess. It goes either way. It's also an opportunity to mix content authors with project stakeholders from across the organization to figure out where their priorities are and aren't aligned, which is really important to determine early in a project, not when you're 4 months into it. Because if different user groups have different ideas of what is and isn't important, you want to know that, and then you can start to dig into how to solve it. One workshop I often run at the beginning of a project is an implementation of what's often called the KJ method. It involves Post-its and dot voting. Many of us have probably encountered that at some time, but it revolves around collecting pain points and issues that internal users want to see addressed, and then figuring out how to prioritize them. I typically refer to this as the airing of grievances exercise. So every attendee is given 5 Post-its and 3 dot stickers, and they write down their 5 biggest issues with their current website, and they can be anything they want, whatever comes to their mind. And if they don't have 5, that's fine, but 5 is the max. And you give them, 5 or 10 minutes to write them down. And then one by one, each person is given the opportunity to state their issue, describe how it affects them, and stick it on a wall. They get that time. Nobody interrupts. Nobody else says anything. This is their time to say their piece. I usually don't give a time limit, but you do want to keep things moving if you have a lot of participants. If you encounter duplicates of the same problem, you stick them on top of each other so you have an idea of how many there are. And that's the first step. As you're stacking notes, I often start to think about the themes that are emerging and start to maybe rearrange and categorize notes as they come in. Are they mostly about user experience or about authoring or performance or design? What mental connections am I seeing between the complaints that are coming in? And so I'll create those as I'm going along and rearrange them. And then once I'm done, I'll condense duplicates into a single note with a number on it so that I know how many people brought that up. I'll often group together things that are similar but not quite the same as well. For instance, again, document management is often a common complaint that I hear from people. And so I might make one note around document management, especially if the other notes are very broad. So after that, I'll have these category notes of the groups, and then I'll ask the participants to place 3 dots on the items that they believe are most important. And yes, they only get 3 because prioritization where you say everything is equal is not prioritization. Then we will rank the items based on the number of votes, and what you end up with is a list of the things that are top of mind, ranked by the people who are voting for them. And sometimes this ranked list comes with a bunch of obvious things at the top, and that's awesome. But more often, you'll find some level of alignment combined with some level of conflict. And a lot of organizations will already know this, and this is an opening to start talking about it. But some will also be surprised, especially if this is the first time a cross-functional group of people have been brought together. And so that's good, too. Getting them to move forward and make a plan can be a lot of work, but you can't solve a problem you don't know you have. And whether online or in person, there's one other task as a workshop facilitator that I think is really important, and that is you have to create some level of safety which allows people to share freely. There's often a power disconnect in these groups. You'll have content editors in the room with business people and executives, and that can be really disarming for people. And so one of the most important things that I try to do is to encourage everyone to bring their best to the table and approach all ideas as equally valuable, regardless of who they're coming from. Coffee. Now, on to implementation. How do we take the things that we've learned about from our authors and put them to use in Drupal? I kind of divide this up into 2 main angles. Content entry is the actual entering of content into Drupal forms, and content administration is the support of content that has already been entered or is in the process of being created. So we'll look at content entry first. Now, content entry mostly focuses on building HTML forms, which are one of the oldest features of the web. And if you've been doing this for a while, you're probably pretty familiar with HTML forms and some of the issues that come along with them. But content entry screens have a lot of differences that make them need to be approached in a different way. As an example, many forms on the web are meant to be filled out once and forgotten. If you're registering for a new account at a site, you're going to fill out that form and then you're out of there and you'll never see it again. Whereas these forms in content entry and CMS systems are often going to be filled out literally thousands of times by a single person. Another problem is that many of these forms can contain a ton of information, interrelated fields that link to other content in the site, lots of metadata. They're much more complicated than many of the forms on the web that people fill out day to day are. And they're going to need a lot of support in terms of training and documentation and other resources. So a lot of the principles of form design can work in these cases, but when things are bad, that bad is exponentially worse because of how often these things get used and how complicated they can be. So when I'm designing content entry forms, one of the first things I want to do is reduce cognitive load. Cognitive load theory was developed by John Sweller in the late 1980s to describe the mental effort needed to learn new things. And the theory goes that individuals can only hold so much information in their working memory at once. And if you present more than they can hold, then their memory becomes overloaded and learning becomes more difficult. And this can apply to filling out content entry forms as well. The more cognitive load required, the more difficult a product like a CMS will be to use. So reducing cognitive load as much as possible is crucial to a well-designed authoring experience. And this isn't a flat scale. The less familiar someone is with something, the more cognitive load it'll add to their work. So if your site authors are generally familiar with web concepts and have used CMSs before, they'll have an easier time with a more complex form than somebody who is unfamiliar with web concepts or hasn't received a lot of training. Those people are starting at a disadvantage, and so you may need to make more changes in order to get them on board than you would in other cases. Also, again, remember, as I said, that because your content authors will use your interface thousands of times, that cognitive load gets magnified accordingly. At the same time, reducing cognitive load does not mean you make your authoring experience so simple that it undercuts the goals of creating a structured content website in the first place. You know, we could put a WordPress site everywhere and you could have a title and a body field, and that would be very simple. And honestly, that's what many of the content authors that I meet are asking for on a day-to-day basis. But it's woefully unprepared for the complex needs of modern content. The key is to build a system that's appropriate for your use case and then make it as simple to use as possible. So there are 3 general principles I look at to reduce cognitive load for content authors. One is consistency in your authoring experience, and that surfaces in lots of places throughout your interface. Where information is placed. When you make decisions about where things are placed on a form, you should be as consistent as possible with those things. If your taxonomy entry, for instance, is always at the bottom of a form, make it that way for every content type, not high on one and at the bottom and the next and then the sidebar on the third. Same goes for display settings, metadata, etc. Because consistency is one of the biggest factors for reducing cognitive load for content authors. You should also strive for consistency in the field widgets and paradigms in your system. I recently worked on a project which had 3 different technologies for building flexible landing pages on the site, not for any real reason that I could discern or that anybody could tell me, but just that's the way it's worked. And one of the reasons that that was a problem is that content authors were very confused and they never understood which one to use when, and they never got to a place where they were comfortable with any of them. So consistency in that also goes for things like drop downs or auto expand fields. Like, use the same things throughout the system as much as possible for the same use cases. And then you should also be consistent in the terminology you use. Always refer to items on a form using the same words across the system. In fact, let's talk a little bit more about words. Words. There we go. So the words and text we write within the authoring system are a vital element in providing context and information to content authors, and they are often given almost no thought if they exist at all. In her book, Designing UX, Creating Forms That Don't Drive Your User Crazy, Jessica Enders says the core of the interaction in a form is the questions asked and answers given, and that's why the words we use in the form and not how it looks are the most important part of the design. The words on a form can be extremely valuable for helping the user navigate your interface as long as they're thoughtfully crafted. And as we've discussed, there's no one-size-fits-all as far as this is concerned. Knowing your audience and writing for their needs is important. But again, there are some general principles you can use when you're approaching this. Keep it simple. Follow guidelines for plain language. The less words you use and the clearer they are, the easier your conversation is going to be with your content authors. And the more authors you have and the more diverse their jobs and experiences, the more the words that you choose matter. Writing for a diverse group means maintaining a laser focus on simplicity and clarity. That said, if all of your authors are well versed in the jargon of your organization, then feel free to use it here if it helps to communicate with them. Normally, we wouldn't suggest this, but we're talking about a different target audience than we are for end users. I build a lot of sites for government, and government thrives on 3-letter acronyms. And I will use those acronyms within the content authoring system because that's what they understand. But I would never suggest that for the end users. The flip side of that is that you should avoid the terminology of the CMS. Nobody who's your content author on your site knows what a node is. Words like that mean a lot to us, but they don't mean anything to the authors and serve to confuse them. Avoid directional language. Directional language is things like refer to the thing above this or to the right of this. Placement on a form is fluid in the age of mobile and different screen sizes, and different items can be in different places depending on context, or you may just change things over time, and people often then forget to go back and change the text. It's a maintenance overhead as well. And that this is also a big no-no when you're trying to make an interface that's accessible to people using assistive devices. In fact, all of these suggestions are great for accessibility. And then finally, focus on the why rather than the what. Saying what something is doesn't help as much as saying why it's important and how it impacts the content that's being created. Again, the less knowledgeable your users are with web contents, the more this is probably important. Why does this need to be filled in? What happens if it doesn't? What impact will it have on your site's users if done well? These are all super important questions to answer, and it's very common for them to be skipped. Finally, I want to talk about how things are ordered on the form, another thing that's very important but rarely thought about. So during the design phase of a project, you design pages with a hierarchy of content. The most important information goes at the top of the page, then the next most, and et cetera, until you get to the bottom. And a lot of thought goes into this hierarchy. So it makes sense that when people are entering this content, they'd enter it in the same order that it is on the page. The most important first, then the next, et cetera. But many systems are designed with completely random ordering of their fields. So when authors are entering in this system, again, they're often visualizing it from the way it looks more than how they're crafting the words. And so if we can order things in the same order that they are on the page, it'll make more sense for them, and it'll allow them to focus on more important tasks than scrolling around trying to find where the next field is. However, there is sort of another aspect of that, which is how often a field gets used. For instance, in the previous screen that I showed, we have this featured image up here on the right. However, one of the things that we found when we were auditing these websites was that this featured image rarely gets used, and a lot of the times the agencies don't have sufficient imagery to put up there. So in most of the pages, this is blank. So even though this is at the top of the page, we ended up moving it down because it's entered so much more rarely than the rest of the content that's on the top. Again, trying to reduce scrolling, trying to make things easier for the authors and the content that they're editing. When I create spreadsheets of content types and their fields and stuff to hand over to the developers, I always lay them out so that the fields there are in the order they should be in on the form, so the developers have a guide when they're creating these things. So these are just three possible things for content entry. There's so much more to talk about on this topic. Error handling, field validation is a big topic, etc. But I'm going to move on and talk about content administration. So content entry describes the actual entering of the content, whereas administration describes how we deal with the content once it's been entered. And what content type should people choose? What's the workflow? How do people find and manage it? So one of the things that we can do is create editorial dashboards. The authoring experience starts right after people log into the CMS. And a common feature of CMS systems is to put a list of recent content on the page with some search options. And that's fine. But something more customized and personalized for use cases can really set the tone for people and allow them to access frequently done tasks in an easier way. This is a project that I did when I was at Lullabot for the American Booksellers Association. This was a platform for bookstores to manage their online presence in e-commerce. So in addition to the standard list of content, we made these custom landing pages that allow users to see their new orders or their orders in process or the orders with payment pending, because this was the task that the people using the CMS were often doing most often. These custom landing pages can provide authors with an overview of their work in progress and all sorts of other things, but what's appropriate for these landing pages is different from org to org and even between roles in a specific org. But some common things that we'll put in them are work in progress, obviously what you're working on or most recently have worked on, work that other people have worked on but that you need to deal with. So often that's something that you need to review as part of a workflow or look at. It can also be, here's some content that hasn't been looked at in a long time. Why don't you check it to make sure it's still accurate? This is a great example of when the dashboard that you provide for one user role may be different than the dashboard that you provide for another user role because of different needs and different access and permissions and things. We'll bring in alerts from external systems like SiteImprove or Google Search Console, highlight issues with accessibility or other things, 404s and URLs and tips to fix them, and then easy links to documentation and support. Another thing that we talk about is choosing a new content type. Because creating a new piece of content will often be the first order of business for an author once they log into the system, and it's also one of the most important choices they'll make. Content types are designed to serve a specific business purpose, but content authors will often create the wrong content type for the content they're creating. And this might be out of habit or because they don't understand how the content types differ, or one content type is more flexible and they prefer it, etc. But guiding users to provide the proper content types is critical. Some of these choices are straightforward. Nobody's going to choose to create an event when they need to create a blog post, although I have many times seen people do the opposite. But some examples are more subtle. So for instance, what's the difference here between news and press release? It's pretty unclear how these two types differ. And again, if we look at the words, these descriptions don't specifically explain the difference between the two content types. They talk about what they are, but not why you might choose one. So clarification of the why and how it's used is, again, something that you can use to guide authors towards making better decisions. Think about the research you've done. What are the use cases authors have? What do they encounter in their day-to-day? How can you use that information to provide better descriptions to match their expectations and guide them towards choices? Another problem here is that this short description doesn't provide a lot of context around the content type. Here's the same content types with some different information and a different presentation. So there's a lot more here, and all of it serves to provide more context to content authors. In addition to the short description, there's an opportunity for extended information which can provide more context. Now, in the case of news, it clarifies where the postings will be placed on the site, as well as stating that this is not appropriate for official updates. In the case of press releases, it clarifies where to go to check if this use case is appropriate, as well as the additional information that images can't be used in press releases. And this is a good cue because if you have images in your content, this tells you this might not be the place that you're looking to use. The page thumbnails and icons also serve to provide more context to users because, again, authors often think of their content and how it's going to look when it's published rather than the content of the content that they're putting in there. And seeing these two different layouts gives them something that they can tie their head into and visualize, and gives them a sense of grounding. The icons also provide more cues for these descriptions. And finally, there's a link there to view existing content of a type so that authors can check and see examples of how it's been used. But this brings up one other point, which is that the needs of new users are often different than the needs of seasoned users who have been around for a while. And when we first tested this component, with our content authors, a common complaint was that the extended descriptions and imagery take up a lot of screen real estate, and it means more scrolling to get around to the things that you need to. So what we did was we created a choice to them so that they could have it in list view or grid view. List view was the default for anybody who's coming in, but if they chose grid view, you got this more compact view that you could see there. Something else we talked about doing but never implemented was setting favorites on content types, because somebody in the marketing department might do a lot of press releases, but somebody else might do different kind of content more commonly. And if you can bubble those things to the top, it gives them more easy access to the things that they've done. This module is called Type Tray. We built it at Lullabot for the state of Georgia, and we now use it as a standard on they now use it as a standard. Sorry, when you're at a place for 12 years and you only left 2 months ago, old habits die hard. And they use it as a standard on every project, and it's up on Drupal.org if anybody wants to look at it. Before we wrap up, I want to address one last topic, which is designing for accessibility. Just as accessibility is important for the end users of your website, it's also important for the users of your content authoring tools. People with cognitive and physical disabilities need to enter content too. Most of us are probably familiar at one level or another with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. However, there's a whole other set of standards called the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, or ATAG. It's difficult to get into this topic in any real depth, but ATAG outlines two broad areas of concern when it comes to authoring tools. The first is that your authoring tools interface should be accessible in and of itself. So making sure status indicators like grammar and spelling markers are accessible to those using assistive technologies. You should respect any OS level user settings that anyone has set. Dark mode, zoom level, etc. Any preview shown should be as accessible in the preview as the content when it's rendered on the front end. A lot of live preview tools that I've seen do not meet this, and they should. And then finally, the entire interface must be keyboard navigable. And this, especially when we get into more complicated page building tools, is something that is rarely implemented and is going to be a big problem in the coming years as those tools become more common. The second part of ATAG indicates that your system should allow the creation of accessible content. So this includes things like, does the tool create accessible markup in its templates, and does it allow users to create accessible markup in its templates? Are editors given guidance to create accessible content? For instance, being given the ability to add alt text to images, explaining what the alt text is for and how to write good alt text. Is there a way for authors to perform accessibility checks on their content, and are authors given the tools to fix them when they're found? This is a whole other topic, and there are lots of ways to approach this. I'm sure we've all seen, for instance, the CK editor button that you can check to check the accessibility of your field, but that is a very limited check because it only checks one field at a time, and you may have lots of fields on your form that interact with each other different ways when they're rendered. So I also like to look at front-end accessibility checkers. There's one that I was looking at recently and whose name I've forgotten. But basically, if you're a logged-in user and you're looking at the website, on the front end, it has a little thing at the bottom that says, here are all of the problems on this content.
Editorially?
Yes, that's the one. And the great thing about that is not only does it check in a more holistic way, you don't actually have to press the button to check it. It's always there. And I think there are use cases for both of those things, but again, a larger topic for another day. And then, does the documentation for the system promote accessibility? Drupal's default backend is actually pretty good when it comes to ATAG, and there's a large number of issues in Drupal's issue queue about that, but there's also a lot more work to do there, as well as in tools like CK Editor that we implement from other places. There's a tracking issue for ATAG 2.0 conformance, which you can find on Drupal.org in the project queues.
Greg, real quick, sorry to interrupt. Just for folks here, Jeannie's giving a talk on editorially right now, so that'll be out.
That's right. I saw that, and I was bummed that I couldn't go. Yes. Sorry. You all missed that.
It's being recorded.
Yes, exactly. Assuming she pressed the big red button. And that's it. That's what I've got about content authoring right now. I am in the, I don't know why that's not displaying. I am, a couple of years ago, I got very focused on this tool after doing a lot of work on client projects, and I put together a pitch for a book publisher called A Book Apart to write a book about content authoring experiences. That pitch, to my great shock and surprise, was accepted, and I began working on that book, got into the draft and editing stage when A Book Apart folded all of their operations and closed. And so I pitched my book around to a lot of other publishers to no avail, and earlier this year ended up creating a Kickstarter to fund the self-publishing of my book, which succeeded, and I raised $12,000 to fund the publishing of that book. That book is, through all of its structural changes, is in copy edit now, and we're doing all of the stuff to create fonts and page layouts and stuff like that, and I hope to have publication up and running by the end of the year. It's called Designing Content Authoring Experiences, and there will be much more about that if you want to follow me on LinkedIn. I'm sure I'll have more about that. I haven't gotten to the point where I've created a new website to take pre-orders or anything, which is a big fail on my part, but here we are. So if you're more interested in this topic, it goes into a lot more depth on a lot of this stuff, and I hope that you'll find it interesting and dig it up when the time comes. And now I'm happy to take any questions. Mike.
I got two. Back when you were talking about interviews, do you bring anything like early wireframes or anything to kind of kickstart the conversation?
We don't, because we didn't talk about prototyping, but usually in interviews, I'll find the people who are very engaged with the project, and then when we start getting into prototyping, I'll come back to them and bring those solutions. And I don't like to get too into that. One of the things that I see a lot of people do is they start solutioning before they understand the problem, and that's something that I try to avoid. So I try to talk to people first, work on that stuff, and then bring it back to them to see if I'm hitting the mark.
Yeah, I struggle with that, but sometimes the conversation just and maybe I'm just not that good at it, but getting the conversation going.
Yeah.
Without something.
Right.
Just to see an idea.
I mean, one of the reasons why I often approach the interviews with what's not working for you is because people really like to complain about their CMSs. So it's often a good way to get the conversation started.
So I have a second question as well. So we were talking about the designing the form.
Yeah.
For longer forms with a lot of fields, I mean, in your experience, do you find, what's the best way to handle long forms? I mean, I've had clients who absolutely hate, vertical tabs.
Right.
Anything where something is hidden. So any, best practices, or is it client by client, or? I
personally don't mind when things are hidden. What I hate is when required things are hidden. So that's, one of the biggest things, because a lot of times, I've seen, for instance, people, in the interest of making things easier, divide long forms into tabbed interfaces, but then they'll have required fields behind the tabs, and the tabs aren't always obvious. Or they'll do things where they have a set of options, and different fields will appear or disappear depending on the options that you had earlier in the form, and some of those will have requirements, and then you'll get messed up with that, and I don't like that kind of stuff.
Well, it's not about you, it's about your clients. But
yes. But I actually like collapsible. I like the collapsible field sets quite a bit, and I'll often go that route, especially for stuff that's not critical. And so, that's something that I'll often use. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of times, sometimes we'll just have a lot of fields, and we just need to figure out other ways to make it easier, because there's not a lot of great solutions.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about multi-step forms?
I never use multi-step forms for content entry.
Yeah, we're doing get through the validation of step 1, go to step 2, get through that validation, go to step 3.
I have never done that.
Okay,
No.
interesting.
Yes.
We have a huge, 90% of my users are only editing a website between once a quarter
Yeah.
and once a year.
Yeah.
So do you have any best practices for them? Because what ends up happening is they're it's my yearly update time. Okay, let's schedule some co-working time, Veronica, so you can come
Yeah.
teach me how to do everything.
Well, what I don't recommend is giving them the keys to the kingdom and letting them loose on their own. I think that the thing is that what I see there, and this is a common problem, is that that's not a CMS problem, it's an organizational problem, because those people shouldn't be updating the website at all. They should be giving their updates to somebody who knows how to use the website to do. And that's not always possible either. And so, I think the best thing that you can do is what you're doing, which is to shepherd them through the process, help them along, because you can't expect them to remember how to use the CMS if they're only using it once a year, right? It's like literally not their job. And that's the problem. Like, they're being asked to do something that's literally not their job. And a lot of what I talk to organizations, and I see this a lot in higher ed and in government, is that they are bringing users to the table to use the CMS that are not outfitted or set up for success to do that. And what would be best is to set up a situation where they hire people who are the content people who interact with the people who hold the content and create a collaboration between them. But that's off the table in a lot of the situations that I see.
Yeah, it's off the table in ours.
Yes. Yes.
Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
This is really good direction that we have here. So when you're defining your content types, the fields, things like that, preparing for the developers, you had mentioned on these forms to have good description text. Are you putting that like in your spreadsheet, and is that what they're transposing into the interface?
Ideally, I like to have our content strategy people build all of that text and then push it through. I think that one of the things that we run into a lot is that a lot of agencies, they don't have that kind of cross collaboration between the development people and the content people, and so that communication can be hard. And like in my projects at Lullaby, I would often be the person who literally designed all the content types and laid them all out and handed them over just to implement, but a lot of agencies don't work that way. And so, creating that collaboration is the first important step, because you don't want your developers writing these descriptions. And then finding a place for them to put that text that is, again, collaborative, that everybody's working on together, is the other important part. And then the third part of that, because changes always happen over time, is to make sure that when changes happen, that information is brought back again so that they can be updated. And so, the collaborative piece is really the most important part of that, rather than any of the tools that you might use.
And I think the spreadsheet approach is really nice for QA testers.
Oh, yeah.
As well.
Yep.
As opposed to like a ticket in Jira sort
Yes.
of thing for each one.
Yeah, and then they can go through and say, oh, this is supposed to have a character limit of 50, but I can put 70 in there, and that's a bug, and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah, and we'll outline all of that stuff, like the field, its type, its widget, its validation rules, all of that, like in every row, all the way down, 1 page per content type, giant spreadsheet.
Well, I think you do a good job here of highlighting the admin UX experience, the big blind spot that Drupal's trying to address. So is there efforts that your approach here is backfilling into things like Starshot?
I haven't been very active in that myself. I know that when I was at Lullaby, I spent a lot of time talking to Christina Chmilis about her work on the admin interface, and with Lori about that as well. But most of the work that they were doing was more like, for instance, they were like doing a big redesign of the menu at that time, and I was more interested in the information architecture of the menu, right? Like, where is all of this stuff? What does this stupid structure menu mean to people, and why is all this stuff thrown in there? Why can't taxonomy be over here? Because I can never give access to my clients to the structure menu, and then they can't get to that, and etc. And so. But she never got to that, so that's the kind of thing that I would be more interested in getting involved in. But I will say that over time, the trend in Drupal's admin interface has been to something that's cleaner, that's more readable, that's more usable, and I've seen positive things out of that trend, but I've also seen people create horrific, terrible user interfaces out of it too. So.
The big reason why people don't like Drupal is admin.
Yeah.
How does this apply? Like, I run into problems where I'll set up content types that have that maybe one is using layout builder and one isn't. So that, say you have like a privacy policy page, you don't necessarily want it to be layout builder so it's easy to edit or whatever. But then you have other pages that you do want that full experience. And then over time, maybe we'll have a page that has like an in-page nav that will automatically load as you add. You know, so then we'll have 3 pages that are kind of all content pages, but we made different content types for them. And then after a couple of years, the client's like, oh, can this page be a layout builder page?
Yeah.
And so then we like turn it on for the privacy policy so they could drop in a block of something. And then after maybe like 4 years, you've got like 3 different content types that all basically can do the same thing. And then it's super confusing again. Do you have a good, like, what's your strategy on the page component side of things? And like, because this I think is great, but what's your strategy on the content types? Like,
I will say that this problem that you're describing is the single biggest issue with flexible page layout content types in organizations.
Right.
Yeah.
And that once they exist, the organizations want to use them for everything, and
Yeah.
once they're starting to use them for everything, their content lacks any meaning whatsoever.
Yeah.
And then when they want to migrate, they're like, oh, let's take all of our press releases. Well, you don't have press releases. You've just got a bunch of layout builder pages, and you can't do stuff based on the semantic meaning of the content because there is no semantic meaning. There's just a bunch of 3-column blah 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 or 2-column blah blah blah. Nothing means anything anymore. I have a big rant about that in my book.
So are you like
That should be the second.
recommending heavily structured content types only?
No. What I'm recommending is governance on the part of a client in conjunction with the people who built the site.
Right.
Because, for instance, when we did this thing for the state of Georgia, we built a big layout builder page type that they could use for landing pages, right? But we also did things with it that made it very difficult to use for anything else.
Right.
So, for instance, one of the things that people were always asking for was, oh, I just want a text box that's HTML that I can drop onto these landing pages. And we always say no, because once you do that, now people are going to build any page using this, and that's not good. And so we have to have like often very tough conversations with our clients about why they don't want to do that. And we also very carefully designed a set of components for those landing pages that were very flexible to do different things, but were also very contained and have lots of guardrails.
Right.
And so that's like, and that's the kind of thing where it's like, it needs to be a conversation between you and the client, and you need to make sure they really understand what the implications of doing things are, or somebody on their side needs to understand it and act in that role, because that becomes a thing where it's an ongoing discussion. And I do think that in lots of cases, there are use cases for this and for that, because, you know, like one of the things, I don't have this slide right now, but that I talk about a lot with clients is that, like, if you have a bunch of events on your page, you don't want an event where the ticket link is up here, and then on the other the ticket link is down here, and then the ticket link is over here. You want that consistency. That's what brings users to the site and gets them to use it. And that consistency comes from structure and templates. And so you want to keep that. It's very important. But you know, their tendency is always, oh, I just for this one event I want to have this big giant link here and blah blah blah. And you've just got to like continue to have that conversation and say, well, I see your need. What can we build into over here that will give you a little more leeway in how you present things, but not go over the edge, right? And that all of that is tough, and it requires a lot of work, a lot of back and forth with clients, and it's one of those things that, again, a lot of people who are working with clients are much more in the, oh, that's what you want? Fine, I'll make a ticket and do it. And that's where things go wrong, right? It's totally like client relationship building and governance on the side of the client and working with their content authors. It's like, so I say it all the time, most clients' problems with CMSs are not technology problems.
Right.
They're people problems. Like, and I say that all the time. Clients will come to us with these gigantic things, and I'll talk to them, and I'll be like, this new CMS is not going to solve any of your problems unless you implement the organizational change to take advantage of it. And that's like all of the hard work is there.
okay.
Are there any like tools in your toolbox that are like, we always use like an event team or like certain things that are a little less Drupal default that you recommend as like guardrails for the learning experience?
I will say that one thing I always try to do is, and there are different ways to do this, but like I've always, one of the things that drives authors crazy is when they have to select a piece of related content
Yeah.
that's not created, and they have no way to create it other than leaving the screen that they're on and going somewhere else to create it and coming
Yeah,
back.
reference.
So I'll do things like I'll use inline entity form a lot of the times, or one of the other, there are lots of different ways to approach that. But the fact that Drupal doesn't do that by default still blows my mind. I mean, literally 20 years ago when we did our first site for the Seattle Times, that was one of our biggest pain points that we were complaining about. And it's still just like no default solution in Drupal at all whatsoever.
That module called add and reference was made 2006.
Yeah, inline entity form's been around forever too. So it's like, and then you should also not just be able to add, but when there are existing pieces there to edit, to be able to remove them all from that one place so that people don't have to chase after that stuff. So that comes to mind as a very common piece
Then
of.
are you like putting them into modal hell or something? Like they're going down the rabbit hole?
Well, there are different ways to do it with different tools. Like some of them have modals, but like inline entity form will often open the form in line and close it, so that can work. But that's also a content type design problem, because if you're designing like this cascade of linked content, then that might be something that you want to reconsider or think about, because you are going to send people down that line over time.
Yeah, and if you focus on just the information needed for the referencing part
Sure.
of that content, then that form now becomes 3 fields
Right.
instead of 45 that they have.
Or maybe there's stuff that like, a lot of times I feel that people kind of like over design their content types, where it's like maybe a little bit of repeated data in order to not create the complexity of having a related content type is okay, because it's not used that often, or it's fed from another place, or different things like that. Like people tend to get very like analytical and purist about that stuff in a way that often I find is not helping.
Interesting.
Cool, thanks everybody.